Hi there, Steve McVeigh, one of the pastors here at Lamont Wesleyan Church. If you're watching this video, you probably know this, but we never know who might drop in on us. We, as a group, both people in our congregation and frankly people around the country, are watching these videos as we read through the book of Acts, a chapter at a time, during this time when many of us are at home because of COVID-19. And we're trying to work in a new rhythm into our life that whenever this changes, whenever we're able to go back into some sense of normalcy, that we will have developed a habit that will make us strong in our relationship with God and center us in such a way that we're growing and becoming more like Jesus every day. And so we are in Acts 26 today. And Acts 26, if you did not read Acts 25, you need to go back and read that, because really chapter 25 and 26 are the same story. There's a chapter break there, but there really isn't a story break. And the Apostle Paul, just to set the setting, the Apostle Paul has been brought before this group of dignitaries. And right at the center of that group is Agrippa and Bernice. And Agrippa, just so you get a sense of why this is significant, Agrippa was the one person in the Roman Empire who understood Judaism, because Judaism was foreign to the Roman mind. They could not conceive of there only being one true God. They could not conceive of why it was so hard for Judaism to just merge itself into emperor worship. And they did not understand why the Jews wanted to be so separate. I mean, there's all sorts of things that they just did not understand. They tried to appease the Jews. And just so that we can really understand the story again, I've mentioned this, we need to understand that all of the stuff going on behind the scenes here in the culture really ended up putting Rome in a position where, because they did not understand Judaism, they just tried to eliminate it. They flattened the city of Jerusalem. And part of the persecution that took place in the first 100 years of Christianity, and really throughout the first 300 years, came from Rome. Most of that persecution came from Rome, and part of it was linked to Rome's misunderstanding of Judaism and the fact that Christians were unwilling to say Caesar is Lord. They would say Jesus is Lord. And so just an interesting backdrop to this. But here is Agrippa. The Apostle Paul gets to speak to him. And there are two things that I want to point out in this story. And they're both very important. So let's just jump into it quickly. Paul is doing exactly what we have prepared to do. Paul is giving the story of his conversion. Some would call that a testimony. And he has talked to them. He is given permission to speak here in verse number 1. And he addresses King Agrippa, and he just says, I consider myself fortunate. Literally what he says is, I congratulate myself that I get to speak to you. And then he tells us his story. He tells us about what he was like before Christ. He tells us about his conversion, and then he tells us about what Jesus has done for him. And I really am hoping on Sunday I asked you to do that. I asked you to write out those things and to pray a bold prayer. Well, here the Apostle Paul is in a unique situation before kings, giving his story. And an interesting thing that comes out of his story is that when he tells a story of how Jesus appeared to him in a vision as he was on the road to Damascus persecuting the church. This is what Jesus says to him. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, this is interesting information. What are goads? Well, listen, if you're from where I am, let me just give you the Kansas version of that. It is hard for you to kick against a hot shot. It's cattle prods. This is what it's referring to as cattle prods. And so In that particular day, they didn't have electricity, so obviously they didn't have a hot shot, but they would have these long poles with a sharp, pointy edge. And if a steer or if a bull or all those other names for animals or for the bovines that I had to learn when I got here, honestly, when I arrived in Lamont 20 years ago, conceptually, I think I understood the differences, but I had some lessons to learn about that. But when they're going the wrong way, if you want to get them in a chute, you have the prod. And here is what is suggested, that the Apostle Paul, as he was persecuting the church, was being pricked in his conscience about it. What an interesting picture. Now, I believe, and we've referred to this before, so this is a little bit of review, I believe it's because of the grace that Christians showed when they were being persecuted. Specifically, the way that Stephen, as he is dying, rather than calling for his rights, instead is asking for forgiveness for those who are doing the act, asking for forgiveness for Saul. There was something there that was pricking him. And so in my alone time today, I'm gonna sort of come to this point twice today. In my alone time today, one of the things as I meditate, I may want to ask is, are there some pricks in my conscience? I mean, are there some things that I've been ignoring? Jesus says to Saul, it is hard for you to miss these goads. You know they're there. Are there some things in your life you know God is calling you to turn away from? Are there some things in your life that you know God is prompting you to do, a place he wants you to go, and you can just feel that? Don't resist that. Listen, whenever God calls us to do something or calls us to stop doing something, it is always, and I mean always, for our good. It really is. The second thing that I want you to see, and I'm going to just refer to this quickly as well, is that the Apostle Paul, having given his testimony, gives a direct address to Agrippa. And he says to him, after being called crazy or out of his mind, and basically what was said to him by Festus was, Paul, you are too smart for your own good. It's driving you mad, which shows us how esteemed he is in terms of his education. He had went to the Harvard of rabbi schools. He had the best rabbi in that time that he had come up under. He was a smart dude. And so he's told that you're mad. And here's what the Apostle Paul says in verse 26. The king, referring to Agrippa, the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. Here's what he's saying. King Agrippa, you're an expert in Judaism. You know about Christianity. You know about the way. And then he says directly to Agrippa, do you believe? Do you believe? He says, do you believe the prophets? I mean, he is calling him. And Agrippa's response is, do you think in such a short time I would become a Christian? And the Apostle Paul just lays it out there. I want you to think about this. He lays it out there. He says, King Agrippa, with respect, I don't care if it's a short amount of time or a long amount of time. I would love nothing more than for you to become a follower of Jesus. You know, we've been praying this week about the opportunity to share our faith. I just want to gently point out to you that sometimes we just have to make the call. We just have to, maybe as a salesman might say, you just have to make the ask, but at some point, you have to invite the person and say, do you believe? Do you want to accept? You know, it's one thing for a person who's coming to Christ to feel those pricks. It's another thing to have them turn. You see, because the goads come to mind again, in my mind. There's no doubt that Agrippa is feeling some goads in this moment. And what Paul is doing is he is saying, as a witness to what God is doing inside Agrippa, Agrippa, would you turn? Agrippa, as you feel God, would you go in a new direction? Listen, as you're sharing your story, as you're sharing your faith story, if you sense from God that you should ask the question, will you believe? I know it's hard. I mean, I know that there's all sorts of fear involved. I mean, what if they ask a question I don't know? Or what if they say no? Will it ruin my friendship? And sometimes we value the friendship more than we value the friend. We really do believe that eternity is at stake when someone's making this decision about coming to Christ. And you and I have to be willing at some point to say, do you believe? And so during your quiet time today, this is two sides of the same coin. Are there some things that you feel that God is using? And this is a funny picture in a way, especially since I'm being solemn. Is God using a hot shot on you in some way? Is there something that a direction that he's asking you to change? And then, are you willing? Are you willing to say, will you believe? Hey, listen, that's actually some pretty heavy stuff. I'm going to pray today that as you have your private time, that the Holy Spirit will speak to you clearly. We will see you tomorrow as we go into Acts chapter 27.